Hi folks, this is going to be chapter 4, part 1. And before we get into government price setting, it's important that you understand consumer and producer surplus. I'm assuming you've read this already. It's covered exhaustively in your textbook. But if you haven't, or you need a quick refresher, let me quickly summarize consumer and producer surplus. When we have a market that's in equilibrium, everyone who purchases gets to purchase at the equilibrium price. There were lots of folks who would have been willing to pay more than the equilibrium price for this product, though. That's evidenced by the fact that the demand curve is actually above the equilibrium, or I should say there's areas of the demand curve that are above the equilibrium. The area that's underneath the demand curve but above the equilibrium price represents all of the good deals that consumers were able to capture by buying at the market price. This is referred to as consumer surplus. Producer surplus is the exact opposite, or perhaps a corollary. Producers get to sell all of their output at the equilibrium price, but there were lots of them, as evidenced by this portion of the supply curve, that would have been willing to sell it for lower amounts. Because they didn't have to, they captured what is known as a producer surplus. That's this area here. We're going to use those in our discussions of ceilings and floors, and we'll be able to tell what the impacts are on efficiency once a government starts setting prices. Okay, so let's look at some instances where the government actually mandates a minimum price in a market or a maximum price. When the government mandates a minimum price, they're in essence putting into place a price floor. Now for that floor to actually make any difference whatsoever, it's got to be above the equilibrium, because if it were a minimum price below the equilibrium, no one would care. So before we start to look at the implications of a price floor, let's go ahead and mark out the original equilibrium and our original consumer and producer surplus triangles. We'll mark out the producer here in blue, and let's use red for the consumer. Those two triangles represent our original starting points before any floor is put into place. Once we put a floor into place, we now have a mandated minimum price. And this minimum price is, of course, going to raise the cost of air travel for consumers. As air travel got more expensive during the late 30s to the mid 70s, consumers stopped taking as many intrastate trips. These were the ones that were regulated. Quantity fell because, of course, it doesn't matter if you've set a new higher minimum price if you can't find buyers. So, what does this mean for our market and efficiency? Well, for starters, consumers not buying means that sellers aren't selling those flights either. So this portion of the producer surplus is gone, and this portion of the consumer surplus is gone. Collectively, this triangle here in black is referred to as deadweight loss, and the easiest way to understand this is it is lost transactions. You can't get good deals on flights that you're not purchasing or selling. Aside from this inefficiency represented by deadweight loss, you also can recognize that there is a chunk of the consumer surplus triangle that is no longer theirs. This portion here, marked out in blue, is actually going to be transferred over to the producer, because they do get to charge this new minimum price at the price floor. And all of the area under the price they get and above their supply curve is producer surplus. So that rectangle gets added on to what's left of their original blue triangle. The consumer gets the worst of this deal. All that's left for them of their original red triangle is this tiny triangle here on top. So, what to make of this price floor? One, you've got to recognize that price floors cause an inefficiently low output. When we drive quantity down to Q1, we know that this last unit here had an MB, as represented by the value that a consumer was willing to pay for this last flight, that is greater than the marginal cost, which is represented by the price that a producer would have needed to provide that last flight. If MB is greater than MC, we're violating our golden rule, and we've introduced in some allocative inefficiency. On top of that, you also have another result we'll refer to as number 2. We get inefficient allocation among sellers. This new artificially high price allows some airlines to hang on even though they wouldn't have been competitive if you'd forced them to compete with other airlines that may have wanted to enter in. You're also going to get wasted resources. Number 3, you're going to get people who hang around and they shouldn't be here. And aside from that, you're probably going to get a fair amount of people competing on the basis of quality. And this high quality is actually a problem. I know it seems strange, but when you don't allow firms to actively compete, then what you're going to end up with is they compete not on price, but they compete on non-price factors. We saw all of these airlines starting to give out blankets and peanuts and snacks and all of these in-flight amenities. These in-flight amenities are nice, but I think that if you asked most people if they'd rather peanuts and a blanket or they would rather the flight be $100 cheaper, most of them were probably going to say that they would have taken the cheaper flight. Hence, we get an inefficiently high quality. Lastly, whenever there's a minimum price or a maximum price in place, there's the potential for illegal activity. Mostly because you haven't changed the fact that there were suppliers who were willing to produce at these lower prices. And there were obviously folks who would be happy to pay lower prices. So just because you've made it illegal doesn't mean you've changed the fact that people would have willingly engaged in those transactions. Okay, let's take a crack at price maximums, which is really what a price ceiling is. We'll start out once again and we'll mark out our original equilibrium price and our original equilibrium quantity. And we can highlight our original consumer surplus, have an intersection up here at the top, and our original producer surplus. So what happens when we actually impose a price maximum? In order for it to matter, it's got to be below the equilibrium. Otherwise, everyone would just ignore it and transact at the equilibrium price. So essentially what you're doing with a price ceiling is you are lowering the price. And for obvious reasons, consumers are going to get excited about that. They're going to want to go ahead and they would have a much higher quantity demanded at this lower price for apartments. Okay. The downside for them is that there aren't as many producers who are actually willing and able to supply at that price. So some of those producers might immediately start thinking about converting into condos or selling their properties. And of course, just like with a floor, it's the short side of the market that matters. You have to find willing buyers and sellers. And so without as many willing sellers, it doesn't really matter that there's lots of folks who would like an apartment at this lower rate. So you're going to end up with deadweight loss in a ceiling, just like you had deadweight loss in a floor. All of this area represents lost transactions or deadweight loss. Can't get good deals on apartments that aren't being bought or sold. These are just lost. So this is, of course, why we have our first result, which is inefficiently low output. Now, aside from seeing the deadweight loss, we can also talk about transfers of consumer surplus, transfers of producer surplus to the consumer now, because of course they're the ones who are going to benefit from this lower price. This rectangle, which used to be part of the producer, is now going to get transferred to the consumer, and they'll add that on to their already existing consumer surplus. The producer is left with whatever they previously had, minus the transfer. So effectively, a ceiling is sort of like a tax on producers that distributes that economic surplus to consumers. And of course, market folks are upset about this because it's going to lead to an inefficient allocation amongst consumers. You're going to get consumers who now get some of the existing housing stock that weren't the people who were willing to pay the most for it. Market folks would say that they are the ones who are inefficient because they were not the ones who would have been willing to pay the most for the resource. In other words, the resource isn't generating as much happiness as it might have otherwise. Now, there's something subtle going on here. I want you to recognize that the way that market folks are talking about this is that someone's deservedness of a resource is only reflected by their willingness and their ability to pay for that resource. Social justice folks and people who are more interested in some of the normative stuff are going to freak out about that. And in fact, there's something maybe a little bit icky when you really think about market rationing, especially when we're talking about basic necessities of life. Market rationing means that if there isn't enough of something, whoever can spend the most on it are the ones who quote unquote value it the most, and they're the ones who quote unquote should get it. Okay, back to our list here. You're going to expect wasted resources with a ceiling as well, because with this new shortage that exists in the housing market, you're going to have a lot of folks running around and looking for housing when they wouldn't have had to bother with that at all. They could have just rented a place easily before the shortage. You're also going to end up finding that the existing housing stock isn't as well maintained, because you don't need to maintain a building well if you've got a whole horde of people that are always scrambling to get into a vacant apartment. You don't need to fix the sink. You can neglect all sorts of normal landlord duties. You also are going to expect underground markets. If it's really that difficult to get an apartment, it's not going to take long before people start bribing landlords to get on the list and perhaps even paying above the legally mandated ceiling. This would, of course, be an underground or an illegal transaction. But they both have obvious incentives to engage in this, and this is one of the problems with legally mandating prices. You've never changed people's willingness to buy or to sell. You've just told them they can't do it. Okay, as a brief aside, we've looked at floors and we've looked at ceilings now. An economist would tell you that these are positive analyses of the efficiency impacts from price minimums and maximums. They're right about that, but don't miss out on the hidden assumption that efficiency is the thing that should be privileged. Lots of folks that argue in favor of ceilings or floors recognize that it's going to cause some inefficiencies, but they really don't care because there's some other normative value that they think is worth suffering the efficiency for. I think that's a fair way to look at a lot of these things. Anyways, it gives you something else to chew on. I'll talk to you soon.